How did the fall of a superpower reshape the world we live in today? The collapse of the USSR, a titan of the 20th century, marked an end to a bipolar world dominated by two superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union. Throughout the Cold War era, the USSR wielded immense influence, its tentacles reaching into every corner of the globe, from the bustling streets of Eastern Europe to the jungles of Southeast Asia and the emerging nations of Africa. This vast empire, built on a foundation of communist ideology and iron-fisted governance, seemed as permanent as it was powerful. However, the very size and diversity of the Soviet Union sowed the seeds of its eventual downfall. Internal pressures and external influences began a complex interplay, setting off a domino effect that would eventually lead to its dissolution. As we peel back the layers of history, we uncover a series of pivotal moments that led to this monumental shift. To understand this monumental event, we must first dive into the roots of its decline. The cracks began much before the actual fall. As the 1970s dawned, the Soviet Union appeared unshakable, a superpower locked in a Cold War standoff. Yet beneath this facade of power, the seeds of unrest were germinating. Economic stagnation was taking root, exacerbated by the leadership of Leonid Brezhnev, among others, who clung to old methodologies that stifled innovation and economic growth. During Brezhnev's time, the Soviet economy was characterized by extensive rather than intensive growth. It relied heavily on increasing the amount of labor and resources used in production, rather than improving efficiency or technology. This approach initially produced impressive results. However, by the late 70s, the limits of this strategy became painfully apparent. The economy began to stagnate, and the standard of living for the average Soviet citizen ceased improving. Compounding these domestic troubles was the Soviet-Afghan War, which began in 1979. This decade-long conflict drained resources, both material and human, and became a demoralizing quagmire that drew unfavorable comparisons to the US involvement in Vietnam. The financial strain of supporting a war that seemed unwinnable began to weigh heavily on an already burdened economy, undermining the government's credibility and morale both at home and abroad. In a bid to reverse the fortunes of the faltering giant, Mikhail Gorbachev introduced major reforms after his ascension to power in 1985. Perestroika, or restructuring, was aimed at decentralizing economic control to increase efficiency and productivity. Alongside this, glasnost, meaning openness, sought to infuse the system with greater transparency and freedom of expression. These policies were radical, intended to rejuvenate the Soviet system through reform rather than revolution. Yet, as revolutionary as they were intended, Gorbachev's policies opened up a Pandora's box of nationalism, criticism, and demands for greater autonomy within the Soviet republics. The more the government attempted to tighten its grip, the more the system seemed to unravel. While intended to strengthen the Soviet Union, these policies inadvertently hastened its disintegration. Freedom whispers became roaring demands. As the 1980s progressed, the Soviet Union faced not just economic stagnation and political unrest, but a burgeoning nationalist movement within its own borders. This surge was particularly pronounced in the Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, and Ukraine. Regions where the call for independence grew from a murmur to a defining shout. In the Baltic states, the push for independence had deep historical roots, stemming from brief periods of autonomy between the world wars. By the late 1980s, these republics witnessed a dramatic resurgence in national identity and cultural pride. This was catalyzed by Mikhail Gorbachev's policies of glasnost and perestroika, which inadvertently gave the Baltic populations the tools and the voice to demand more autonomy. One of the most poignant and visually striking demonstrations of this Baltic unity and defiance occurred on August 23, 1989. Approximately 2 million people joined hands to form a human chain that stretched over 600 kilometers across Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. This peaceful protest, known as the Baltic Way, marked the 50th anniversary of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact that had led to their annexation by the Soviet Union in 1940. It was a symbolic act of enormous significance, illustrating the deep desire for freedom and independence in the face of oppressive power. Meanwhile, in Ukraine, the echoes of nationalism were revived with equal fervor. The cultural revival known as Ruk began to gather momentum, transforming into a political movement that demanded more autonomy from Soviet control. By 1990, Ruk had become a major force, organizing rallies and protests that drew hundreds of thousands of Ukrainians. These gatherings were not just demonstrations of Ukrainian nationalism, but also explicit calls for independence. The rise of these nationalist movements signaled a clear shift in the political landscape of the Soviet Union. The traditional bonds that held the Soviet republics together were unraveling at their ethnic seams. The fire of independence was spreading, and the center could no longer hold. August 1991, a coup that sealed the fate of the USSR. In the sweltering heat of a late summer, a group of hardline communists launched a desperate attempt to cling to the eroding power structures of the Soviet Union. They placed Mikhail Gorbachev under house arrest at his vacation home in Crimea, falsely claiming he was ill and had been relieved of his duties. The architects of this coup, including top members of the KGB and the Soviet Army, aimed to reverse the liberalizing reforms that were fragmenting the Soviet state. They believed that only a return to the strict, centralized control of earlier decades could save their power and their nation. However, they underestimated the appetite for change. Boris Yeltsin, then president of the Russian Soviet Federative Socialist Republic, emerged as a defiant symbol of resistance. From atop a tank outside the Russian White House, Yeltsin denounced the coup and called for a general strike. His audacity rallied the citizens who poured into the streets of Moscow. Erecting barricades and facing down the tanks of the coup plotters, the coup's leaders found themselves paralyzed, unable to muster the support they had anticipated. The military, crucial to their plans, was divided. Many units refused to turn against their fellow citizens. After 3 days of tense standoffs and widespread civil resistance, the coup collapsed. Gorbachev was released and reinstated, but the event had irreversibly weakened his position. More critically, it had galvanized the public and political momentum towards dismantling the Soviet system. The failed coup was a clear signal. The old ways could no longer govern the new spirit of the Soviet people. By December 1991, the Soviet Union was on the brink. The stage was set for a seismic shift that would echo through history. A pivotal moment arrived with the signing of the Belozhesk Accords. Gathered in the Belozhesk forest, leaders from Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus decided the fate of the giant that was the USSR. These accords declared the Soviet Union effectively dissolved and announced the creation of the Commonwealth of Independent States, or CIS, a loose confederation intended to manage the breakup and maintain connections without the tight-knit union of the past. This was not merely an administrative shift, it was the definitive end of an era. The Belozhesk Accords stripped the Central Soviet government of its power, leaving it an empty shell, a relic of a disintegrating dream. Mikhail Gorbachev, the last leader of the Soviet Union, found himself presiding over a country that no longer existed. With little choice left to him, Gorbachev resigned from his post on December 25, 1991. In his resignation speech, he expressed hope for a democratic progression in these newly independent states. Simultaneously, Boris Yeltsin was rising as a formidable figure in the new Russian landscape. As the president of the Russian Federation, Yeltsin took the reins of the largest successor state of the Soviet Union, steering it through turbulent times into the post-Soviet era. And thus, on December 25, 1991, the red flag over the Kremlin was lowered for the last time. The collapse had profound ripples that shaped the new world order. In the immediate wake of the USSR's disintegration, Russia and the newly independent states were thrust into a tumultuous period of economic hardship. The transition from a centrally planned economy to market-driven systems was anything but smooth. In Russia, the abrupt shift led to significant inflation, a sharp increase in poverty, and a decrease in life expectancy that underscored the severity of the crisis. Simultaneously, the map of Eastern Europe and Central Asia was redrawn overnight. 15 republics emerged from the shadow of the Soviet behemoth, each grappling with newfound independence. Countries like Ukraine, Kazakhstan, and the Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, faced the daunting task of building national identities and governance structures from scratch. On the global stage, the vacuum left by the Soviet Union prompted a strategic realignment. The United States emerged as the sole superpower, navigating a new unipolar world. NATO expanded eastward, absorbing former Warsaw Pact members who were eager to integrate into the West. Meanwhile, China began to ascend economically and politically, positioning itself as a new center of power in the evolving international landscape. The long-term impacts of the Soviet Union's collapse have been profound and far-reaching. Globally, the end of the bipolar world order reshaped international security dynamics. leading to conflicts and alliances that continue to evolve today. Economically, the integration of Eastern European markets into the global economy has spurred growth and development, albeit unevenly across different regions. Culturally, the fall of the Soviet Union facilitated an exchange of ideas and values that had been stifled during the Cold War. From the spread of pop culture to the exchange of scientific knowledge, the barriers that once divided East and West have increasingly dissolved. The fall of the Soviet Union was not just the end of a superpower, but the beginning of a new era in global relations.